Hello and most welcome to 1545. It's been a bit of a hiatus here, or caesura, whatever you want to call it, with the wonderful book by Paul Johnston, Wittgenstein, Rethinking the Inner. I will have a bit deeper look at it. And we've been earlier discussing perception and thinking. Let's now go more into thinking, make it a bit clearer in the lucid style of Ludwig Wittgenstein. I really like. We are presently on page 92, last paragraph. We've been talking about the process of thinking, whether it's early on we said, is it imagery, is it an inner talk, in a speech, or maybe it isn't any of those things at all. To illustrate this point further, and now we're talking about the line of thought or the immediacy of thinking. And one mentioning here that could be helpful is what accompanies the words is like a series of small secondary movements. To illustrate this point further, consider the example of giving someone a list of errands. Here it may be enough to give a fairly vague indication of what each errand involves. The other person may say she has understood, but we do not prescribe what the other has to do if he is to understand the list. And whether he really understood is determined from what he does later, or from the explanation we might ask him to give. However, if thinking does not involve doing anything specific, why should it involve doing anything at all? If someone who checks that she has understood moves in thought along part of the path she is later to follow, why shouldn't she be able to see that she knows the way without going along it even partially. If the task is obvious, the individual may simply say yes. And the fact that she did not do anything does not show that her answer was mechanical. On the contrary, the instant response may be a sign of intelligence. The test of whether she was thinking about what was being said is not what goes on inside her, but what she later does. Only if she is able to carry out the instructions accurately will we say that she was paying attention to what she was being told to do. Against this, it is tempting to argue that only introspection can really tell us what thinking or paying attention consists in. But even if introspection did show us something, how could we be sure that this is the characteristic process of attention? Furthermore, how would we know that the same process goes on in others? In fact, when we ask someone to read attentively, what matters is not that some process goes inside her, but that she takes careful note of the passage being read. And is able, for example, to give an accurate account of it. A description of the images she had while reading it would have a different interest. Even if we could always give an account of these images when we read attentively, but not when we read inattentively. This would not mean that having images constituted attention. When we say someone has read a passage attentively, we are not interested in the colorfulness of her experience, but in what she can now do. Conversely, the significance of saying she read the passage without thinking about it is that this implies that she was distracted, that the passage made no impression on her, or that she won't be able to discuss it. Etc. In all these cases, the idea of thinking as a mysterious inner process is irrelevant. What matters is how the person acts and the type of possibility for interaction with her that this creates. For this reason, quote, it would make no sense if somebody who had had an animated conversation with me were thereafter to assure me that he had spoken entirely without thinking. But this is not because it contradicts all experience, that a person who can speak in this way should do so without thought processes accompanying his speech. Rather, it is because it comes out here that the accompanying processes are of no interest whatsoever to us and do not constitute thinking. We don't give a damn about his accompanying processes when he engages in a normal conversation with us. If therefore we abandon the idea of thinking as a process, what are we left with? Consider a case when we would say that a thought had occurred to someone. For example, the case of someone making a decision. He says, I want to go out now, then suddenly says no and does something else. As he said no, it suddenly occurred to him that he wanted first of all to, he said no, but did he also think? No. Did he just think about that other thing? One can say he was thinking about it. But to do that, he didn't have to pronounce a thought, either silently or out loud. To be sure, he could later clothe the intention in a sentence. When his intentions changed, maybe a picture was in his mind. For example, if he wanted to close the cupboard, then maybe he said the cupboard. If he wanted to wash his hands, he might have looked at them and made a face. But is that thinking? I don't know. Don't we say in such cases that someone has thought something over, has changed his mind? The point about thinking is that we do not apply it in relation to a specific process. But use it in the context of the individual behaving in certain kinds of ways. The concept does not describe the behavior, but characterizes it as the action of a thinking being, and hence as the manifestation of a particular thought or intention. Here it is worth noting that we might extend the concept to an animal if it behaved in a similar way to the individual described above. If, for example, the animal had been trained to fetch an object from one place and take it to another, and it started walking towards the goal without the object, and then turn back, we might say that it had changed its mind. Do you get it? It's like the inside and the outside in normal parlance gets confused, and he's untangle those uncertainties or confusions. Here we know nothing about what went on inside the animal, and since it does not possess language, its thinking certainly cannot consist in it saying anything to itself. Rather, what justify applying the concept is a certain complexity and purposiveness in its behavior. Similarly, someone who is making something will be said to be thinking while she works. But this does not mean some special activity accompanied her work. Rather, it distinguishes this action from one of a very different sort. As these examples show, the concept thinking does not apply to a particular process, but highlights certain aspects of human activity. The best way, therefore, to describe thinking is to describe the difference between someone who is feeble-minded and a normal child who's beginning to think. To do this is not to embrace a sort of behaviorism, for as Wittgenstein points out, if one wanted to indicate the activity which the normal person learns and which the feeble-minded cannot learn, one couldn't derive it from their behavior. The person who can think does not do something the feeble-minded cannot do. Rather, her whole activity has a different character, and this is what our use of the concept thinking points out. So how can that character be defined? The answer is it cannot. If we do try to define it, the first problem we encounter is that anything we point to as an example of thinking only functions as such against a wider background. Furthermore, the only way of explaining the concept is in terms of examples from our own lives. The paradigm of someone who thinks is the normal human being. And it is only on this basis that the concept can be extended and applied elsewhere. Although the ability to express thought in language is central to the concept of thinking, we might nonetheless extend the concept to non-language user if their way of acting was similar enough to our own. If we were to see creatures at work whose rhythm of work, play of expression, etc., was like our own, but for their not speaking, perhaps, in that case, we should say that they thought, considered, and made decisions. That is, in such a case, there would be a great deal which is similar to the action of ordinary human beings. And it is not clear how much has to be similar for us to have a right to apply to them also the concept of thinking, which has its home in our life. But what would be the importance of saying these people thought? Well, it might be crucial in determining our attitude to them, and in purely practical terms, it will make a big difference to us whether the creatures can only learn mechanically or can develop new ways of doing things themselves by trial and comparison. Here again, however, what should be called making trials and comparisons can in turn be explained only by giving examples, and these examples will be taken from our life or from a life that is like ours. To illustrate these points, Wittgenstein considers a simple experiment drawn from the psychologist Köhler. In the experiment, a monkey is trying to get a banana from the ceiling of the room. But can't reach it except by putting two sticks together and getting hold of it in that way. What, Wittgenstein asks, must go on inside the monkey for us to call this an act of thought? One answer might be, unless he acted through chance or instinct, the monkey must have seen the process before his mental eye. But this is misleading. On the one hand, it would be too much. One could have the thought without having the image, and on the other, too little. We should not call it thinking if the monkey simply acted out of chance, mental imagery. What is important is that the monkey must have reflected. Catching hold of the stick must be something he gets hold of inwardly. But what does this involve? Well, we'll look for signs of reflections, signs perhaps that the monkey explores other ways of getting the banana before finding the right one. We shall also look at how he learns from his experience. Suppose, for example, that to begin with it just is a happy accident. How must the monkey now act for us to say that he can think? He says to himself, as it were, "That's how." And then he does it with signs of full consciousness. If he has made some combination in play, and he now uses it as a method for doing this or that, we shall say he thinks. In considering, he would mentally review ways and means, but to do this he must already have some in stock. Thinking gives him the possibility of perfecting his methods, or rather, he thinks when in a definite kind of way he perfects the method he has. Here, what is important is that we say he thinks not because we discover a particular process in him, but because he acts in a certain way. To put the idea of inner activity first gets things the wrong way around. For it is only because he acts intelligently that we say thinking takes place within him. Having made these points, it may still seem strange that we cannot define thinking, but the point is that we do not learn the word through a definition. One learns the word think, i.e. its use, under certain circumstances, which, however, one does not learn to describe. We learn to say it perhaps only of human beings. We learn to assert or deny it of them. The question, do fishes think, does not exist among our applications of language. It is not raised. End of quote. This may seem to undermine our earlier discussion of when we would say that a monkey would think. The point of that discussion, however, was to cast light on our concept of thinking by investigating the considerations which might lead us to apply it outside its usual context. The aim was to show that, as Wittgenstein puts it, there is such a thing as a primitive thinking, which is to be described via primitive behavior. Thus, there are ways of acting which can and do lead us to describe non-humans as thinking, at least in a primitive way. In doing this, we underline the similarity between their lives and ours. It is not, and this is important, that we detect outer signs of an inner process. Rather, we impute a notional inner process on the basis of the animal acting in certain types of ways. This is entirely different, has nothing whatsoever in common with the view that inner processes are the important. Here we learned that, on the other hand, it's more about the interactivity. But the pattern of the concept, the notion of thinking as a mental activity, is only complete when the individual can express her thought. That is, when she applies the concept in the first person by saying, I think. So the major confusion is to think that thinking is an inner process. That, so to speak, is where it starts. It does not mean it's meaningless to speak of an inner process. But when we do that, we need to realize we are doing something completely different. We are doing a comparison, and actually we never ever talk about an inner process. We use the word inner to describe something we can interact with, something we can see, something that we can unconsciously, if you like, interact with, all the different signs of the body and tones in the voice, but never ever is it a matter of something truly in it. And of course, from this complication comes a whole strand of misunderstanding, like the Cartesian idea of an inner mind, res cogitans, without any extension in the world and without any place in the world. Non-local mind is scary. It is goddamn scary. Wittgenstein shows a healthier way where you can actually progress your thinking, how you do it, because all of a sudden it takes skill. It always had taken skill, but now you can realize you can change. It can be better to talk and do the things that we blatantly just put under the rubric of thinking, thereby obscuring everything, make it an enormous unknown big box of secrets, like the secrets in the second Indiana Jones, where the Holy Ark was placed in a storage facility somewhere under the CIA, I think. Wittgenstein is sharp as a knife, but he does it the only way that is possible, not putting regular arguments for his thing. And then, in that case, would he have done that, he could have fallen into the same trap as he's trying to show us out of. Innerness causes everything. Causes Descartes, it caused the analytical philosophy, caused the blurriness and unclearness of Bertrand Russell, his friend. It has been germinating the whole modern era of philosophy in the Western Hemisphere. Philosophy of language, philosophy of logic, philosophy of science, and so forth and so forth. Never ending. And it can all clear up. It can start to make sense. This is invigorating. This is a saving thing. An oasis in the desert of nonsensical thinking that leads to limitations, non-understanding. Well, it was a sheer pleasure. Thank you very much for listening and seeing. Have a very pleasant night. Bye bye. Sun's still up here up in the north.